So our next speaker is Ron Clark. He is the Executive Director for Kairos Church Planting Support, an organization developing and mentoring church planters, new ministers, and new churches and campus ministries. He's an adjunct faculty member at George Fox University and Portland Seminary, and is co-chair of the New Testament and the World of Early Christianity section of the Society of Biblical Literature's Pacific Northwest region. Clark has been a minister and church planter in Portland and partners with local and state agencies addressing houselessness, intimate partner and sexual violence, trafficking, and building healthy families. He has authored books and journal articles addressing domestic violence, houselessness, biblical texts, and theology. Today, he will give a talk entitled, Your Warriors Will Become Women, the Feminization of Exiles, Captives, and Survivors in Ancient Yehud.
Thank you. So let's begin. Do you see the full PowerPoint?
I do. I see the full PowerPoint screen.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. And then let me make sure this is up, so we're good. All right. So I'm actually, one question they may be asked a lot is, why is this guy presenting here? And that might be the biggest mystery, but as a person who's worked with biblical texts and then done ministry, I found the opportunity to bridge the gap in working with a lot of different areas of ministry along with texts. The paper is available through SAS, or you can email me at the email address there for a copy of that. Ancient texts use feminine language toward many individuals who suffered violence through military conquest, sexual assault, and forced migration. Valiant men are described as weak, afraid, confused, prostituted, or rape victims when defeated by a more powerful nation, king, or God. The Hebrew scriptures also use this type of description to indicate the defeat of Yahweh's foes within the community of Israel or outside its borders. This gendered violence language can be ruthless, cruel, and misogynistic. Biblical texts, however, use this language toward Yahweh to nurture and protect victims of similar violence so that shalom can exist. The God of the captives was also oppressed to redeem the exiled nation. In the Christian movement, this suffering Lord also is identified with oppressed population, marginalized by the dominant culture. The humiliation of Jesus became an identifying mark for this movement. As a minister working with intimate partner violence, houselessness, prostituted individuals, and others who are marginalized through feminization by a toxic masculine culture, I find a strong connection between the God of exiles, captives, and survivors. This shared identity provides hope and healing to those oppressed by a culture labeling them non-masculine. And so my take then is to begin with what we would call the so this is not working.
We're seeing the entire the PowerPoint
okay.
working screen.
Okay.
You should click the.
So what I should do is that. Is that better?
Still seeing the working screen. Can you click the from beginning?
Yeah. So what I think I need to do is try this one. Is that better?
There we go. That's right.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. We've been using Zoom over a year and a half, and here I'm still having trouble. Okay, so on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about some of the ancient texts. As we read through many of the ancient texts that are in the ancient world, such as Egypt, let's move to this next one then. Well, that's not working either. I'm sorry. There we go. All right. And so in many of the ancient texts from the ancient world, we find this language used in reference to, for instance, Enuma Elish, and the language used as Marduk, split Tiamat like a shellfish. The whole concept of fettering, putting them in chains, holding them down, oppressing them, using them as a footstool. That was very common in Enuma Elish, and of course, human beings being created to be slaves of the gods to make their life more easier. We also read this in many of the Assyrian texts that use very graphic descriptions of oppressing soldiers, warriors, treating the soldiers or the warriors like they will become women or they'll become prostitutes. the idea of trembling, collapsing, knees bowing, and so forth, kissing, bowing the feet, shaving the beard, described in texts, iconoclasty, the destruction of the gods and the statues, destruction of the land, torture, imprisonment, humiliation, rape, humiliation of an opponent, enemy, and hyper-violent death, hyper-masculinity, murder, and even psychological terrorism, as Nemet Najat says about Assyria. They used a lot of psychological terrorism in their texts to oppress other cultures to get them on board. We don't read as much about this with Nebuchadnezzar, but you do read this in other Babylonian texts as well as Egyptian texts. The whole idea, of course, of these texts was to show that this is what happens if you don't fall in line. And I think we see this, even today, but mostly in the ancient world. There's this idea of humiliating the enemy, oppressing the enemy, making sure that they understand who's boss, who's in charge, proving that your gods are weaker than our gods. And so as in the paper, I describe a lot of this and give a lot of examples of how this language is used. But when we come to the term, feminization, what do I mean by that? What is that, how we use that in domestic violence and so forth? My definition of feminization is basically, it's just a language of humiliation. And while we have always said that females and males are equal, they're deserving respect, we know that a dominant masculine culture uses feminine terms to humiliate others. And so this feminine language is used to prove that one is not truly masculine. And this dominant culture is the one that defines who is not masculine. Typically, it's a military culture or a king or a violent, hyper-masculine, hyper-violent god, hypersexual god as well. Feminization legitimizes the oppression of another individual or group, and it justifies, this is why we can do this, they're weaker than us, they're not men, they're not masculine, and so forth. And so we see this term as being used quite often in the biblical text. Yes, we do see this used by Yahweh in some of the prophetic texts as well, but it's the idea of humiliating another culture. If we understand when the nations of Israel and of the Yehud were taken captive to both Assyria and Babylon, these traumatized communities experienced this form of humiliation. Things such as the emotional distress of being taken into captivity. You see many of the Hebrew words used throughout the prophets that suggest the ideas of being imprisoned, fettered, chained, bronze fetters, imprisoned in a pit without water, the idea of heat, the idea of being in the furnace. And we understand that the exilic community expressed this form of humiliation as a captive nation. We also know that there was mourning was common throughout the captives. And another thing is of course, post-traumatic PTSD, PTSS, traumatic bonding. There's the idea of the evil eye, the gaze, the memories. And why I bring this up is in our work with my regional Society of Biblical Literature, American Academy of Religion, I've talked a lot about many of the houseless individuals in the homeless villages that we've built here, and working with them, their feelings of being exiled and displaced. And we found a lot of similarities between the exiles of Yehud, as well as many of the individuals who live on the streets, who are in these houseless villages. And in talking with a lot of my colleagues, they've indicated that, it's a kind of a way to put, skin and flesh on these individuals that we read about. As one of my colleagues said, I've always seen the exilic people as kind of a literary construct, but she said, these terms kind of make it real, that these are truly captives. These are displaced individuals. The emotional toll of captivity and of the humiliation that they experience in the world carries a tremendous emotional content in the scripture. And of course, Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars, we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of those songs. And so the idea of the gaze, the evil eye, I hear this in individuals in our houseless villages. What are the things that people say about the homeless? What are the things that people write on Facebook about the homeless? What happens when the news comes out as a story on a lot of our youth groups or campus groups working to build some of these villages? What happens when it's posted and you start reading the comments? The language that's used towards captives, towards those in exiles, can be very traumatizing and can be emotionally damaging to the men and women and children in these areas. And so we get this idea that the captives who experience this form of humiliation, the feminization, the terms used to oppress them, now we're seeing them through the texts. But even more, these individuals who are in captivity, Yahweh continues to be their God. If we understand the stress and the emotional toll that the captives are facing, loss of a temple, the loss of God's home, the loss of honor, the level of shame that exists in that community. Yet Yahweh continues to be among them. We read this in some of the the Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. These are stories of heroes who live in this culture and rise up, or even Ezekiel, Jeremiah, who live in the ruins or live in Babylon, and they experience this level of shame, yet Yahweh continues to be among them. The prophets live among the people. Samuel Meyer points out that the prophet is in the divine council in the earlier prophets, but as we move towards the exile, the prophet is exiled with the people, and the prophet is not among the council. It's the idea that the prophet represents the people. The prophet represents this disconnection, but Yahweh is also traumatized as well. As we kind of, the comment was made one time in presenting this with a group of guys, to use the current masculine term that is misogynistic, but the idea that Marduk has made Yahweh his, bitch, is the idea that Yahweh is weaker than Marduk. Yahweh is weaker than the Babylonians. So this misogynistic, toxic masculine language that goes around today would be used in that same way. Yahweh is weak. Yahweh is inefficient. Yahweh is not the powerful God that they had believed. And yet Yahweh continues to woo the nation of Israel, the people of Yehud. Yahweh dreams of what can be. Yahweh seeks reconciliation. Yahweh continues to court this nation that's been taken into exile. As Jacob Neusner says, because of this and during the exile, exilic literature takes on a different form. It becomes very creative. It reflects this level of hope, and it reflects this level of shared suffering. I am with you. I am suffering with you. You are humiliated. Therefore, I am humiliated to be with you. And so now the God, Yahweh, the God of the captives, is making this connection, is experiencing this shame with the individuals. And so exilic literature focuses on hope. There's this idea of a new story, a new vision, a new dream. The temple that was rebuilt was really not that glorious, but in the book of Haggai, this temple will be more glorious than the early one. Why? There's this idea of hope. There's this idea of a new story. There's this idea of redemption, or as Jeremiah chapter 14 states, or chapter 16, states, you won't remember me as the God of the Exodus. You'll remember me as the God who brought you out of the north. No longer am I the one who redeemed you from slavery. I'm the one who forgave you and reconciled with you and brought you home. So there's this idea in the text that this humiliated nation now suffers with God. And Yahweh is traumatized alongside of the nation of Israel. Yahweh suffered from sin and rejection. Yahweh was the hurt spouse. Yahweh was the one who was faithful, and yet the spouse continued to be unfaithful. Yahweh suffers with the exiles. As the people of Israel felt, where is your God? That was also a slap in the face to Yahweh. There was a loss of honor, a level of shame that Yahweh has. And yet, throughout the prophets, when I bring you back home, when I redeem you, you will receive this honor. I will be honored. There is honor and reconciliation and recovery. Yahweh offers this level of hope. There's judgment, but there's hope, bringing people back. These are important concepts when you work with people who have immigrated from other cultures, people who live and feel like exiles. The new story, the story of hope, the story of peace, the story of becoming a nation once again is such a powerful message. And Yahweh sought relationship with the people. And Esarhaddon, when he returns, his father Sennacherib takes the gods out of Babylon, and Esarhaddon, he returns the gods so that there can be reconciliation and hope in the land. But yet with Yehud, Yahweh seeks relationship with the people to bring them back home. And we also have, of course, in my book, The God of Second Chances, I talk a lot about the hope that Yahweh offers of reestablishing a covenant or relationship. The land is destroyed, but it's rebuilt. And it's interesting because in Deuteronomy 24, there's that passage that, if the individual divorces their spouse and then that spouse goes on and marries another and that person divorces them, to take that divorced spouse back was defiling the land. And yet this is exactly what Yahweh does. Yahweh takes the divorced nation, the rejected nation, the nation that chased other lovers and has been left alone. Yahweh brings the spouse back. And in order to do that, there's the new heavens and the new earth. And so the land's been defiled. So what does Yahweh do? New heaven, new earth. So the taking the spouse back has this, this cosmic, cataclysmic, apocalyptic language there, that this is all creating something new so that Yahweh can have the relationship. Was Yahweh feminized with the captives? That's the question that we often share with individuals. What does it mean to be the God of the captives? And I want to be clear, when I use the term feminization, feminized language, I'm using that from the perspective of the toxic masculine culture. While I agree that term is wrong, it is a term that is used by militaristic, masculine, toxic masculine cultures. But imagine being the God of the captives and sharing in their fate along with the shame that the culture has placed upon them. And then again, the Torah is once again proclaimed from the margins, not the dominant culture, but from the margins. Switching, then this similar pattern tends to happen when we get into in our work with the Christian religion. And so in Luke 4, verses 16 through 19, the great synagogue sermon that Jesus gives, he talks about freeing the oppressed. He's using that, delivering the people from captivity. Well, as we go through Luke, we find that he spends quite a lot of time with marginalized populations. And in my book on Luke, one of the things I point out is while Homer met marginalized monsters, he killed them. In Luke, Jesus meets marginalized individuals and includes them into the movement. And probably one of the most famous ones is in Luke 7, where John the Baptist sends his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one to come or do we wait for another? And of course, Luke is the only one that mentions, it's mentioned in Luke and Matthew. Luke says in Luke 7, at that time, he healed, and so forth, these individuals. And it's this idea that Luke is saying they had trouble understanding that Jesus was representing the God of the marginalized populations, that he was not here to save those in the dominant culture. He was there to reach the captives, those who were suffering, those who were hurting, those who were needing help. And so we see this in Christianity, along with many of the other passages in Philippians 2, where the Apostle Paul talks about Jesus carrying the shame or the humiliation of the incarnation and the cross. And I think, we've tended to use humility psychologically, having a very calm presence. But the word actually is the idea of humiliation, the humiliation of the cross, the humiliation of the incarnation. And Romans 12, associate with the humiliated, and that's referring to the very poor, marginalized individuals in that congregation. Or 1 Corinthians 1, the idea that you have a lot of slaves and a lot of poor in that congregation, and yet the idea is not many of you are wealthy or wise. God chose the weak type of thing. And so you have this whole concept now of marginalized populations being included because there's a God of the captives, the Jesus being, the incarnation of this, the God of the exiles, and stressing that in early Christianity. And so how to kind of wind down here, this is why I appreciate being invited here, to show that in the midst of all of this scholarly textual work, this is important for today. Some of the things that we've done here in Portland, my wife and I especially, we've worked, for instance, with biblical narrative support groups. We've had, the Exodus, we read through the book of Exodus with women who are domestic violence survivors. And we approach that when we ask them their opinion, and they journal and they write and they give us feedback. What is it like to be under Pharaoh? What is it like to ask yourself, why is Pharaoh so bullheaded? Well, they tell about their, ex-husband, why he was so bullheaded, going to court and the judge, confronting the judge, and the judge, sentences him to even greater punishment than he would have had before. Biblical narrative support groups with some of the women who've left the sex industry or were stripping or in prostitution, introducing them to the text and letting them know, hey, the God of the marginalized populations is a God who understands you. Working with a lot of the men's groups that we've had to work with. What is toxic masculinity, and how does that come across in the text? This language that's used to oppress and humiliate is actually a reflection of toxic masculinity. How do we, as at least in my work in America, and then of course at some work in Malawi and Albania in the past, but in working with in online now with India, how do we help individuals recognize the damage of toxic masculinity and using feminization to oppress and humiliate others? So getting them to understand, what does it mean to have a safe and sacred space? What does it mean to serve the God of the captives? If you, a popular podcast is Christianity Today's The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And Mars Hill was one of those mega churches where they were very much into ultimate fighting, the UFC. And the minister, Mark Driscoll, used quite a lot of very degrading, humiliating language, not just of women, but of men who supported their wives and partnered with their wives, or men whose wives went to work because they made, more money doing that, and the men stayed home. What kind of language was used there? You see, so working, that applies to today and how we work with people. College students, working with college students, teaching at a level where we took some of the violent texts and we had them listen to stories of women whose husbands were abusive, or women whose husbands had affairs, or men whose wives had affairs, and understanding the profits from the hurt God. What does it mean to have your spouse be unfaithful and then to humiliate you and mistreat you that way? This is Yahweh, the God of the captives. This is why the prophets tend, as O'Connell says, that it sounds like sometimes reading Jeremiah, that Yahweh has signs of clinical depression. When you work with people who've experienced that, they can share it. Yahweh's venting. God's just angry. God's feeling this emotional stress. In some of our community work with houseless individuals, vets who have PTSD, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, the sex industry, helping people to understand that the God of the captives understands their plight. The level of humiliation and shame can be identified with Jesus, with God, the God of the captives. And then, of course, congregational ministry, helping a congregation to understand that the Torah is proclaimed from the margins, that the gospel is proclaimed from the margins, but what does that actually entail? What does that mean? How does that apply to our lives, to understand that it's proclaimed from the margins? And who are the people living on the margins? And what is the dominant culture that we are facing? And that's just kind of a quick overview of the paper. I left some time for questions, but this is, of course, I appreciate the time and the opportunity. This is my email. If you have questions, further questions, I want to talk more about our work, but this is the idea of trying to live in both worlds, bridging the gap and bringing them together. So thank you for this time, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ron. That was really interesting. There are a few questions here. One that I myself wouldn't even begin to know how to answer, but perhaps you will. What is the meaning of feminization in Ezekiel 23:4? The older was named Ohola and her sister was Oholiba, and in Isaiah 54.
Yeah, so the first of all, the two adulterous sisters, we do use that in the group with the women who've left the sex industry, because we want them, it's very violent language. What I'm understanding is that, and this is what we would say, this is a God who's been extremely hurt, who is venting and using some very coarse language to express the deep hurt and the deep pain. And the women who, were in prostitution, we're prostituted. As they read through that, they said, we understand that this is a reflection of a God who's deeply hurt, deeply grieving, deeply angry. And that language is very coarse, very harsh, but it's one that expresses deep pain and hurt. And yes, it is misogynistic language. It's hurtful language. They indicated that it helped them to feel safe, like they could connect with this God. And so I hope I'm answering your question, but that is what I heard. And while the language troubles me, and while I had a difficult time even having them read that text, their feedback was, okay, there's a lot of raw emotion here that's flying all over the place, and maybe stepping back saying, okay, it's the depth of pain that Yahweh's feeling and the depth of sin that the nation is creating to God. Hopefully that answers the question. I wrestle with that as well. So,
Okay. Yeah, I think that was a very good answer, actually. I'm not sure what they meant by the question. So, but yeah, I think that was a very thorough answer. Let me see. Some people mentioned parallels to the history of Black slavery, and parallels with any indigenous people who have been enslaved and forced to convert to Christianity. Might be an interesting thread to pull there. Another question, is the Tetragrammaton always used to refer to God in the Exilic literature? I'm sure there are exceptions, but interesting question.
Okay, go ahead. So what was the question then?
Is YHWH always used to refer to God in the Exilic literature?
Wow, I've seen both. I've seen both used, so Yahweh and Elohim, but I'm not, and that would be an area of weakness. I will work on that and find that answer out. My understanding would be that the use of the Tetragrammaton, the Yod Hey, Vav Hey, you have a lot about shame and the name, and I think the use of that just kind of indicates that even though there's this level of shame against Yahweh, there's this, my name is still there, my name is still there, my name is still important, but the name of Yahweh is being shamed in exile because of what's happened in the people who were supposed to be honoring that name. And I love the thread with Native American conversion to Christianity, African American. We saw that with Exodus. We tried a new spin. We just said, well, let's invite women who've been in abuse to share that story, and we find a lot of parallels. But I think we find a lot of parallels, and it helped us, especially when Black Lives Matter, when that was really becoming part of our, last year, we were more aware of it. It really helped us to see that this is just oppressed language, and this is language that really offers peace, or this is text that offers peace to those who are oppressed from any perspective.
Okay, very interesting. There's a comment here. I'm not sure where the question is, but I'll just read the comment as it's written, and you can comment on that. It has been said that El Shaddai is feminine in some way, even meaning the God, quote, of the breast, unquote, and so forth. And then Jesus saying, "O Jerusalem, to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks."
Yeah, there's a, Rahum, womb love has been one. Overwhelmingly, Yahweh is a God of Rahum, there's a lot of language, and that's one of the things that we do with masculinity. We show that there's terms used of Yahweh that in that culture would be considered feminine. And that gives us a broader picture of Yahweh, that Yahweh is not masculine or feminine, Yahweh is God, and that male and female are in the image of God, and we have this shared relationship. An example, Ephesians chapter 5, when I meet with men and women who work with abusive individuals, the first thing we say is don't get in a scripture argument with them, because the Christian abusive individuals, they're manipulative. But we go to that Ephesians 5 passage, and the one about husbands, loving your wives, we compare that with Roman culture, that in that culture, men typically didn't love their wives. And then Paul uses two terms, nurture and cherish, that would be considered kind of feminine in that culture, that we always stress to guys, we are called to nurture. And, how do you nurture your spouse? And it's brought, resistance with the toxic masculine Christian culture. Men don't nurture anything. Well, what do you do with this text? What do you do with that? It's what it says. And so we do see a lot of terms for God, for Jesus, that would be considered feminine in the ancient world. And I think, the followers of God were always meant to be a people who reflected a very nurturing, caring, merciful, loving spirit. And that's going to be at odds with any culture where we live. So I hope that answer, or I hope that was a valuable comment.
Yeah, I think you addressed it quite well.
My boys say I don't always answer questions. I just like to hear myself talk. So I just try to.
I know all about that. Normally the question is just sort of a jumping off point to start saying things that you're interested in. I mean, that's how I treat them anyway. I don't know. I would like to have a list of all places in the Bible that are used to support your position. So I think that's a request for information about the paper and bibliography.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I believe that question was asked before your final slide, where you gave some contact information and more information about the paper.
Yeah. And yes. And sure. And that's just sharing what we've done. Any advice to better that is appreciated. This is a work in progress, but sure, the paper's there, and we can start a conversation. And always would love to build that and help that to be stronger.
Okay. Looking for solid questions here. A few comments that I encourage you to go read and look at. A lot of people have had comments. There's a question here that I think I have to go to Twitch. I can't see the old chat. I can only see part of this question. How can I see the rest of this? Looking for solid questions here. A few. Oh, that's my own voice. Read and look. don't seem to be able to see old chats. I think it was on the Save Ancient Studies Twitch. So we unfortunately don't have the rest of the question. The person who posted that, if you can post it again, it was posted by Lady of Thought. The beginning of the question is, it's great that you're trying to change the dialogue of the Bible to fit your mission to help marginalized societies, especially bringing down toxic masculinity. Do the women or men you work with typically identify as Christian?
Some do, some don't. And I butt heads with faith-based people, men, and we're finding more females. My wife, she butts head with a lot of females. I don't mean that in a negative way, but Christian females, because there's a real resistance. And I would say, you know, I'm conservative. I'd be considered part of a conservative evangelical movement, but that's where I get my biggest criticism, white conservative evangelicals. My wife would say that as well. But we have people that aren't faith-based, and they work with us, they support us, they love what we do, they're encouraging, and we have less conflict with them, believe it or not. So, but we have all different groups work with us in a lot of different ways.
Okay. And there's one last question here. Any comment on the famous neither man nor woman in Christ?
Neither male or female in Christ. Yeah, I think from what I understand, some of the Roman philosophers saw wisdom, and they were coming to a time where they saw wisdom as uniting male and female. And I understand Paul kind of doing that with the Spirit, that the Spirit is really uniting. And this is where you have male or female, slave or free, Jew or Greek. The idea is that the Spirit creates this community where we are one, we are together, we are united. So I would say, as a church where we had houseless individuals, women who were prostituted had come, we tried to create this climate where we were all felt equal, where we all felt one, where we all felt safe. What I found from a lot of the people who came from the marginalized populations, that the key was feeling safe and feeling valued. So when I hear that, neither man nor woman, I hear that as the Spirit uniting people together, the community uniting people, where everybody feels valued and appreciated and supported. And we would call that sacred spaces, because they're safe, sacred spaces.
Okay. I actually had a small question about something in a previous comment. You said something about, like, in a Roman cultural context, Roman men didn't love their wives. I was wondering what that meant. So I took it to mean that they didn't, like, publicly demonstrate affection or things of that sort. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I did a paper on Paul's use of proestemi in, for the elder to be the husband of one wife, must manage his family. So the idea of proestemi. And what I understood from the reading is that typically the elite Roman individuals had their outward affairs or sexual exploits, and the woman was basically just expected to stay home in the isolated parts of the house and raise children and manage the slaves. So there wasn't that level of, hey, I love my wife, like we would use the term love, or like I believe Paul is using the term in Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3, that the idea was, I have my exploits, and then I got a woman that stays home. She's my wife. She's expected to be this way. And, I don't show that romantic love to her like I would outwardly. And so that's what I would be referring to. And that's why I would say, the whole point of loving your wife would be countercultural in that culture, what Paul was asking.
See, well, very interesting stuff. Thank you so much, Ron, for this super interesting talk and really thought-provoking discussion.